God has heard Israel's cry, raised up a deliverer, and made a name for himself by redeeming Israel with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, all so that all Egypt, Pharaoh, and Israel would know that I am Yahweh. Because Israel is not going to serve Pharaoh anymore. Now Israel is called to serve Yahweh. And she is going to do that by listening to his voice, listening to Yahweh's voice, believing his promise, and keeping his instruction, his Torah. Now, this Torah is going to be codified in Exodus 19 to 24 at Mount Sinai in covenant form. But before we get to Sinai, Israel is going to travel from the Red Sea through the wilderness in order to get to Sinai. And we're going to be given advanced warning, unfortunately, here that Israel is not going to be very good covenant partners for Yahweh. These chapters, this first section, 15, 16, and 17, record 3 episodes where Israel's ability to listen to Yahweh and to keep his Torah are put to the test, and the results are not very promising. So 3 episodes: no water, no food, and no water again. A little mini chiasm there. So let's look at the first episode, no water at Marah. Chapter 15, verse 22. Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they go 3 days into the wilderness. They find no water. Finally, they get to Marah, and the water there is bitter, so they can't drink it. The people grumble against Moses. This is a critical word. It's used 10 times here in the book of Exodus. They grumble against Moses. Moses cries to Yahweh, and Yahweh makes the bitter water turn sweet. Now, this short little narrative is placed here at the beginning of the wilderness wandering. It is right after the crossing of the Red Sea, because it presents for us a sort of template for these wilderness tests to follow. It provides kind of a definition for how these tests are going to take place, saying here's how we are going to understand the larger narratives to follow. And it provides for us a little interpretive guideline here. And it says that this narrative is a test. It labels it as a test. Yahweh is testing his people to see whether they will listen to the voice of Yahweh and do his commandments and his statutes, which is kind of weird because he hasn't given them any commandments or statutes yet. We're not at Sinai. There's no 10 commandments. There's no book of the covenant. And yet we have this advanced anticipation of statutes, rules, and commandments coming up. And the question is, will Israel listen and do these commandments? Well, what will happen if they do? Yahweh will lead them to the tree of life. That's kind of like the metaphor that we're given here. They will come to Elim, and Elim means mighty tree. They will be brought to the mighty tree where there will be 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Think about 7 as like a number of completeness or a number of rest. So we have complete rest for all 12 tribes of Israel here in the garden. That is what will be the result of listening to the voice of Yahweh. You will be brought to the garden. That's pretty awesome. That's a pretty good deal. Well, the next narrative here, the no food manna episode in chapter 16, is going to give us a few statutes, rules, and commandments to test whether Israel is going to be a garden dweller or not. And honestly, it doesn't start very well. Israel grumbled about there being no water, and now they're going to grumble about there being no food. Yahweh is going to provide food from heaven, bread from heaven, and that bread, that manna, is going to be a test for them. Let's jump to chapter 16 now and look at Yahweh's test of Israel. Behold, I will bring rain bread from heaven for you. And what's the purpose of this manna? That I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. So let's look at some of the laws regarding this manna and see whether Israel is going to keep them or not. Verse 16, first law. This is what the Lord commanded. Gather an omer. Each of you are to take an omer. Well, let's see if they obey or not. Look at the next verse. The people of Israel did so. However, some gathered more and some less. Wait a second. I thought everyone was supposed to gather an omer. What's happening? When those who gathered more, well, they had nothing left over. But those who gathered little, that is, who followed the voice of the Lord, they had no lack. Okay, so far, not good. We have a commandment that is disobeyed. Let's look at another commandment here in verse 19. Moses is going to say to them, let no one leave any of this manna over until the morning. And yet, look what it says. They did not listen to the voice of Moses. Some left part of it over until the next morning. And what happened as a result? Well, it bred worms and it stank. Okay, there you go. That's what you get for your disobedience, Israel. Let's look at another commandment. This relates to the Sabbath. Quite interesting. Verse 26, 6 days you shall gather this manna, but on the seventh day, it's a Sabbath, don't gather any manna because there's not going to be any. Well, on verse 27, we read that on the seventh day, people went out to gather anyways, disobeying this commandment, and they found none. So let's do a little performance review of Israel at this point. How have they done as far as listening to the voice of Yahweh? Verse 28, the Lord said to Moses, how long will the people refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? If Israel here in the wilderness cannot keep just a few simple instructions, how are they going to walk according to God's Torah as revealed to them on Mount Sinai? This does not bode very well. Well, our third account, this is another no water episode, but instead of taking a test, Israel is going to be the one giving a test. Moses asks them, why do you quarrel with me? And why, O Israel, do you test the Lord? So here, Israel's arrogance and their faithlessness is getting worse and worse. And God's solution here to this no water problem in chapter 17 is quite revealing. Take a look at this in chapter 17. So here we have no water for the people to drink, and Yahweh says to Moses, I will stand on the rock at Horeb. You will strike the rock, and water will come out of it. How is Yahweh, the God who is spirit, how is he going to stand on a rock? What is going on here? What a curious verse. Well, given the narrative's obsession to this point with Israel's failure, perhaps this is a little allusion to Genesis 3:15, where the seed of the woman is struck by the serpent. And so Israel, we see very clearly already, is going to need somebody to atone for their failures as covenant partners, someone to stand in the gap. And that somebody is standing on this rock. And look how Paul understands this narrative. It's pretty amazing. Jump to the New Testament with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Who is standing on the rock? Well, everyone in the wilderness, they all ate the same spiritual food, manna. They all drank the same spiritual drink, water from the rock. And they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. And that rock, the rock which was struck, that rock was Christ. And the connections just are amazing to consider at this point. Think about John 19, when Jesus is hanging on the cross and the soldier pierces his side with a spear, and what comes out? Blood and water. Man, the Gospel of John is amazing. But we're not in the New Testament, we are in the Old Testament here. And let's look now at the next account, Israel's confrontation, their first battle, their first military fight with the people of Amalek. And it seems that this account here in chapter 17, verse 8 to 16, it seems to be telling us that while we do need a covenant mediator, and while Moses himself, he checks a lot of those boxes, we need someone who is greater than Moses. So here's how the story goes. Israel is attacked by Amalek in the wilderness, and Israel is able to contend with Amalek and to fight them off only as long as Moses is interceding for them by holding up his staff on the mountain. The thing is, Moses is weak. he's fading, and he's only able to lift up his staff as Aaron and as a man named Hur are lifting up his arms. Now, Aaron is a priest, and Hur, we learn, is from the tribe of Judah. That is the royal tribe, where the king will come from. It seems that we're being told here that the effective leadership of the people of Israel requires both the priesthood and the kingship, or perhaps a merging of those two roles, but more about that later. So the idea of Moses not being able to do it alone just so happens to be the theme of the very next account, where Moses is going to meet with his father-in-law, Jethro. He's going to meet him on the mountain of God, where Jethro is going to observe Moses arbitrating between civil cases of Israelites who have a conflict between them. And he's going to arbitrate these cases from morning to evening. All day long, he's just sitting as a judge over the people. Now get this. Look how Jethro responds to this when he witnesses his son-in-law acting as judge all day long like this. Let's go to Exodus 18. Look what he says. The language is quite amazing. He is going to say in verse 17, it is not good for you to be alone. It is not good for man to be alone. Does that remind you of the garden in any way? It is not good for man to be alone. And Moses, in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, he's going to say, oh, that Yahweh would put his spirit on all people. You see, God desires to rule his creation with all of his image bearers, not just a single individual like Moses. The vision is for all of Israel to possess the Spirit, to listen to the voice of Yahweh, to keep his Torah, and thereby to mediate the Abrahamic blessing to all the nations of the earth. Well, these two accounts, they give us a foretaste of Israel's interaction with all the nations of the earth. You see, there are two different ways that the nations can interact with Israel. Some nations, like Amalek and like Egypt, they will resist God's people and resist Yahweh himself. And for them, just as it was promised to Abraham, for those who curse you, I will curse. But there's another class of Gentile nation, those like Jethro. Now, Jethro is a priest of Midian. And Jethro, he is modeled after another priest, another righteous Gentile named Melchizedek. Take a look at how Jethro is modeled after Melchizedek. These connections are fascinating. Another righteous Gentile. Both Jethro and Melchizedek are priests. And they both meet with a Hebrew after a battle and before a great covenant is made. Abraham makes a covenant in chapter 15, and Israel make a covenant in chapter 19, right after this meeting. And both Melchizedek and Jethro will bless Yahweh. They will bless God for delivering Abraham and bless Yahweh for delivering Israel out of the hand of the Egyptians. And then look at this curious detail. Melchizedek, he will bring out bread and wine and eat it with Abraham. And Jethro, he eats bread with Moses. Look at that, the same little detail. How interesting. And then this is so bizarre. There are two Gershons and Eleazar. So these are the names of Moses' two sons. And Moses leaves his two sons with his father-in-law Jethro. Jethro comes to Moses, brings Gershom and Eleazar. Now, in chapter 15 of the book of Genesis, Abraham has a vision of the future of his seed in Egypt, where Yahweh tells him that his offspring will be sojourners in a land that's not theirs for 400 years, talking about Egypt. Now, this word sojourner, that is the root of the name Gershom. And we're even told that explicitly. The name of one of Moses' sons is Gershom, For he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And then the name of his other son is Eliezer. And Eliezer is the same name of Abraham's servant who would be his heir if a son was not provided for him, which is Abraham's complaint and his prayer to God in the very next chapter after the Melchizedek episode in chapter 14. Fascinating connections, both about Gentiles who want to get in on the covenant and enjoy the Eden blessing, which is mediated through the nation of Israel. And they do so by praising the God of Israel and his deliverance of his people, and then eats with them in a tent on a mountain. This is amazing. Well, Jethro's statement here, after he hears of Israel's deliverance from Egypt, forms a culminating point in the book of Exodus for its theme of Yahweh's self-revelation. The nations respond to God's declaring who he is. Look at Jethro's statement here in verse 11. He's going to bless Yahweh who delivered you out of the hands of the Egyptians. And he says, now that I've heard this, now I know. There's that statement again. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all gods. And after this, Jethro is going to depart, go to his own country, and Moses and the Israelites are going to go to Sinai. Mount Sinai, where this stiff-necked people is going to enter into a formal covenant with Yahweh in chapters 19 to 24, which we will take a look at next.